So Victoria Cobuz is a master's student at the University of Lethbridge in the Master of Education Counselling Psychology program. She lives in Edmonton, Alberta, and is currently working as a psychometrist. Is currently working on her thesis, and she'll be presenting this research today. She also enjoys skiing, rock climbing, camping, or really anything outdoors. And I'm really just reading off the slide. So I'm going to let Victoria share her slides now and get started with her presentation.
Thanks for that introduction, Erica. I'm just going to share my screen now. Does that look okay?
Looks good.
Perfect. Okay. So hi, everyone. My name is Victoria. It's nice to be here with you all. I'm excited to share about my research, and I'm very happy that MAPS Canada asked me to come and present on this. So for my thesis, I will be looking at perceptions of psychedelic therapy held by psychologists and psychology graduate students in Canada. While we meet today on a virtual platform, I wanted to just begin by acknowledging the Indigenous peoples of all the lands we're on today. As I'm presenting from Edmonton, I acknowledge that I'm located on Treaty 6 territory, and I respect the histories, languages, and cultures of First Nations, Métis, Inuit, Cree, Dene, and all First Peoples of Canada, whose ancestors' footsteps have marked this territory for centuries, and whose presence continues to enrich our vibrant community. So here's an outline of what I'll be covering today. I'll start out just explaining the personal relevance of this research, as well as the purpose and importance of this line of research. Then I'll provide a brief overview of the concepts of psychedelics and psychedelic therapy, and a little bit of a literature review. I realize that this might be some review for some of you, but this background info and history is an important consideration for my line of research, so I'll try to be brief. Next, I'll overview my research objectives, questions, and hypotheses, and then I'll discuss methods and analysis and end off with ethical considerations and implications of this research. So as far as research interests go, I'm interested in learning about novel treatment options, especially since there are mental illnesses that have been shown to be resistant or non-responsive to current treatment options, and psychedelics pose as an old yet newly discovered treatment option that may address the needs of individuals that have not been adequately met by other treatments. One of my other research interests is looking at stigma, so this kind of goes hand in hand with psychedelics. I co-authored a study that looked at the stigma and language of suicide. It was interesting to see how our perceptions of suicide impact the language that we use, and how this has larger implications for help-seeking behaviors and the lived experiences of those who know or who are, or know someone or who are suicidal. And for onto psychedelic research, I was first introduced to this during an undergraduate's personality psychology course I took. My professor would assign lots of readings on the findings of psychedelic studies, which back then was mostly papers from the 60s. So I ended up writing a few undergraduate papers on psychedelics, and my interest just continued to grow as I kept up with the literature and within social media as well. So when I decided to do a thesis for my master's, I knew I wanted it to be something to do with psychedelics, which led me to kind of a deep dive into the psychedelic literature. And I realized that there was not much literature with respect to mental health professionals' attitudes towards psychedelics. And with this gap in the literature, I thought that this was an opportunity for me to fill that gap with my own research on a topic that I'm really interested in. So psychedelics are surrounded by stigma, misinformed public perceptions, perpetuation of myths, and negative connotations. And these often relate back to the unethical research trials and the uncontrolled use that happened in the 50s and 60s. And back then, ethical implications and scientific rigor were not emphasized. So as a result, psychedelics were deemed dangerous, addictive, and not worth further research. And this perception exists within society to this day. So these negative biases have the potential to interfere with healthcare professionals' acceptance of and use of psychedelic therapy, which therefore has implications for accessibility. So it's important to assess those service level perceptions of treatment options, especially since psychologists are the ones who are positioned to administer this therapy. So these are particularly critical for future implementation. And as the promising results of psychedelic therapy point to the potential for more psychedelics to become legal treatment options in Canada, more research is needed on those perceptions. So by understanding the attitudes and the beliefs that are held by mental health professionals towards psychedelics and psychedelic therapy, we can begin to identify potential barriers and opportunities for the integration of this therapy into clinical practice. So now, although I'm sure many of us here are familiar with these concepts, I'll provide a brief overview. So psychedelics are psychoactive substances that produce changes in thoughts, moods, perceptions. They're commonly referred to as hallucinogens as well. On the right-hand side of the slide, I have a list of some psychedelic substances. And psychedelics are generally considered physiologically safe, especially when administered in controlled conditions with proper screening and adequate monitoring processes. But I'll speak more to the safety and risks on a later slide. And psychedelic therapy, which is also commonly referred to as psychedelic assisted psychotherapy, or PAP for short, refers to the clinical use of psychedelics in conjunction with psychotherapy to treat mental illness. The protocol of PAP varies between psychedelics, treatment administrators, and presenting problems, but the current approach typically involves a couple of preparatory sessions, a varying number of drug therapy sessions, and then a couple of integration sessions for incorporating those newly gained insights into daily life. And although PAP may require more time and resources up front, the relatively low number of treatment sessions required for enduring results may pose as a cheaper option in the long run for clients, while also preventing long-term costs for healthcare systems. So here's a brief overview of the very rich history of psychedelics and psychedelic research. So in the 1950s and 60s, recreational and clinical use of psychedelics began to surge. And during this time, Timothy Leary and Richard Alpert, who were psychology professors at Harvard, started the Harvard Psilocybin Project, where they would administer psilocybin and LSD to volunteer subjects who were often graduate students at Harvard and record their experiences. This project had a lack of rigor and methodology and raised some concerns among faculty members and administrators at Harvard. So there were times when Leary and Alpert would also be under the influence when conducting these studies. The conditions were not controlled. There was no random selection of participants. And so in 1963, Leary and Alpert were dismissed from Harvard for administering psychedelics to an undergraduate student off campus. So just as psychedelics were beginning to make an impact in both clinical and research settings, they became associated with counterculture and cultural rebellion in the 1960s. So they were depicted as dangerous drugs of abuse by governments and policymakers. And as LSD was only available for experimental use, an illegal market arose for the drug, which caused more safety concerns. And in 1966, psychedelics and psychedelic research were both prohibited in the US. In 1970, US President Richard Nixon signed the Controlled Substances Act. So he declared LSD and psilocybin as Schedule I drugs in the US as part of his infamous war on drugs. And this war on drugs posed psychedelic research and researchers as illegitimate and dangerous, and many countries around the world began implementing more and more restrictions on psychedelic drugs. And finally, in 1971, the United Nations held a convention on psychotropic substances and designated psychedelics as harmful substances with no medical use and encouraged countries to prohibit their access and use. Within the Canadian context, the history of psychedelics followed a pretty similar trend, but I thought I would highlight some key points that are specific here in Canada. Humphrey Osmond was a Canadian-based psychiatrist who made many contributions in the 50s and 60s towards shifting attitudes and policies regarding mental health treatments in Saskatchewan. And during this time, Saskatchewan had North America's first socialist government, which was strongly implicated in the emerging ideologies and reformist agenda that came with psychedelics. So Saskatchewan began attracting researchers who were interested in researching psychedelics and sort of developing new definitions and treatments for mental illnesses. And Saskatchewan's socialist government supported these efforts by helping to secure research funds. However, due to the larger socio-political context surrounding psychedelics, they quickly became prohibited, with LSD and DMT being prohibited in 1968, and psilocybin followed suit in 1974. Onto the safety and risks of classic psychedelics. So this includes LSD, DMT, psilocybin, mescaline. Despite media campaigns in 1960s that claimed LSD and other psychedelics were associated with chromosomal damage, follow-up investigations revealed that psychedelics are not at significant risk for causing chromosomal damage, nor mutagenic or teratogenic effects, and they have low physiological toxicity. And psychedelics are not considered drugs of abuse. In fact, psychedelics have shown efficacy in clinical trials in the treatment of substance use disorders. With respect to risks, the primary safety concerns are acute and psychological. So this acute reaction, which people commonly refer to as a bad trip, is characterized by intensified feelings of anxiety and fear and paranoia. So because emotions can be intensified when under the influence of psychedelics, it's super important that subjects are prepared and in an appropriate setting to limit the chance of escalated or dangerous behavior. Psychedelics also come with the risk of prolonged psychosis that can last days or even months following administration. This is most likely in individuals with premorbid mental illnesses, and cases of psychosis are exceedingly rare in participants who are properly screened and prepared and monitored, but this does still pose a risk, and so there's an ethical duty to take all precautions possible to minimize the risk. Lastly, hallucinogen persisting perception disorder, or HPPD, commonly referred to as a flashback, is rare, and it's a rare and poorly understood disorder, which refers to a recurrence of perceptual effects, which is usually in the form of visual disturbances. The prevalence rate of HPPD is said to be less than 0.05%, although this kind of varies within the literature. And the incidence of HPPD is much lower in controlled therapeutic or research contexts. So the risks of psychedelics may be mitigated with proper set and setting. So set refers to the psychological state of participants, and setting refers to the environment. So without getting into too much detail here, Johnson and colleagues described guidelines for set and setting that reassure safety of the administration of psychedelics. So this includes guidelines for screening and preparation of participants, study personnel, physical environment, management of administration sessions, and then those post-session procedures to integrate that new knowledge. So while psychedelics are relatively safe physiologically, there may still be psychological risks that need to be safeguarded against. As with any drug in human research, procedures and guidelines need to be in place to maximize safety and address those potential risks. And this is especially relevant for psychedelics, as human research with them was halted for nearly 3 decades due to the unsafe and uncontrolled use of psychedelics in the 60s. So here I will try to quickly go through some findings on PAP within the more recent work. So recent clinical trials have used rigorous research methods, including the use of standardized measures of things like depression and anxiety, as well as randomized clinical trial designs, which are now the gold standard for clinical research. This methodologic rigor of recent trials, coupled with the guidelines that we just talked about for set and setting that increase safety and minimize risks, may point to psychedelic research overcoming stigma and gaining ethical approval. And the first FDA-approved study of MDMA took place was published rather in 2011 by Mithofer and colleagues. And this was the first study with MDMA on humans in over 20 years. So this study found that subjects with chronic PTSD saw significant improvement in symptoms at all time points after baseline, which included a follow-up study that the authors did published in 2013, which suggests enduring results. They reported no serious drug-related adverse events. I've listed a couple here for psilocybin. So Griffiths and colleagues found psilocybin to improve anxiety and depression in subjects experiencing cancer-related depression and anxiety, and these results were sustained at 6 months. Although a number of adverse events occurred during those psilocybin administration sessions, none were reported as serious, and all of them were fully resolved by the end of the session. And there were no cases of HPPD or prolonged psychosis. Another one within psilocybin research, Carhart and Harris compared psilocybin to escitalopram as treatment for major depressive disorder, and they found no significant difference in the antidepressant effects between the two drugs. And at 6 weeks, the secondary outcomes, which included response and remission, were found to generally favor psilocybin over the SSRI, and the incidence of adverse events was similar in both groups, and no serious adverse events were reported. For LSD, Gasser and colleagues found that LSD-assisted psychotherapy led to psychological improvement in individuals experiencing anxiety associated with life-threatening illness. No serious adverse events were reported, and improvement was maintained over a 12-month follow-up period. And then lastly, for esketamine, Barbosa and colleagues administered repeated esketamine to participants experiencing severe depression and reported that most subjects had lower depression scores and decline in depressive symptoms. So the immediate and robust and enduring results of these recent studies point to a promising new treatment option, especially for treatment-resistant depression, as well as cancer and palliative-related depression and anxiety. These populations of individuals experience a type of suffering that is often not met with effective treatment options. So the results of these studies indicate a robust safety profile as well for psychedelics. So as we just saw, research on psychedelics and on PAP has resurged in the last decade or so, which could be due to reduced stigma, privately funded research organizations, and just greater knowledge of sort of those guidelines of set and setting that can help mitigate risks. So I've listed a few examples of research organizations within Canada and the US on the right, which you'll notice includes MAPS Canada. Psilocybin is one of the most researched psychedelics and has shown efficacy in treating health and cancer-related depression and anxiety, treatment-resistant depression, and substance use. And psilocybin-assisted therapy has been recognized by the US FDA, Food and Drug Administration, as a breakthrough therapy for treatment-resistant depression, and was legalized for clinical use in 2020 in the state of Oregon. Within Canada, esketamine has been approved as treatment for treatment-resistant major depressive disorder, and other psychedelics, including MDMA, psilocybin, LSD, are available for use in Canada through either legal exemptions for compassionate use on sort of a case-by-case basis, or through the Special Access Program, or through some of the clinical trials that are taking place in Canada. So altogether, this progress indicates a growing openness regarding psychedelics within the field of psychology. So here I've summarized some recent research on perceptions of PAP. So Barnett and colleagues surveyed psychiatrists in the US regarding their attitudes towards classic psychedelics, and they found that psychiatrists perceived psychedelics as potentially hazardous, especially or appropriately illegal for recreational use, and a large majority conveyed optimism regarding the potential clinical use of psychedelics. And the authors noted that younger male and trainee participants reported less concern about the risks and more optimism about the therapeutic potential of psychedelics. Barnett and colleagues followed up their study from 2018 by surveying psychiatrists in the US. The majority of participants believed that psychedelics show treatment promise, and there was strong support for federal funding. And this follow-up study also assessed knowledge of psychedelics. So favorable views towards PAP were associated with greater knowledge of psychedelics. And interestingly, this follow-up study did not reveal that same association between more favorable views of PAP and younger age and male gender. Davis and colleagues surveyed psychologists in the US. Participants were randomized to one of two conditions in which they were presented with vignettes and then corresponding questions. The authors also used a modified version of a treatment acceptability rating form to measure acceptability of PAP, and results showed that a large majority of participants in both groups were in support of further research on psychedelic therapy. A couple more studies on perceptions. Meyer and colleagues conducted some semi-structured interviews with interdisciplinary healthcare providers from a palliative care team in the US to assess attitudes towards psilocybin therapy, and revealed there was uncertainty about the benefits and risks. In New Zealand, Reynolds and colleagues interviewed healthcare professionals who provide treatment or support to cancer patients, and they looked at perceptions of the use of PAP in cancer patients. Participants expressed intrigue and openness to the idea of using PAP, and openness appeared to be impacted by a lack of efficacy within currently available treatment options. And lastly, Hearn and colleagues surveyed counselors, counseling students, and counselor educators in the States to assess perceptions of psychedelic therapy. So they sort of extended Barnett and colleagues' 2018 study by inquiring about previous psychedelic use and sort of looking at the role that personal psychedelic experience plays in perceptions. So for the most part, it looked like participants agreed that psychedelics show promise in psychiatric treatment, future research is deserved, and results also showed that positive attitudes towards PAP were associated with self-identifying men, students, younger age, having fewer years in the profession, as well as previous personal psychedelic use. So to my knowledge, no studies of this nature have been completed in Canada. So most of these have been done in the States, and results can't necessarily be generalized between countries. And since each country determines which substances are controlled, it's important to assess perceptions within Canada as well. There is a study that I believe is currently underway in Eastern Canada through the Toronto Metropolitan University that looks at attitudes held by Canadian mental health care providers and students regarding PAP and psychedelics more generally. I haven't heard any updates on this, but it looked very promising. So moving on to my study, I have 5 research objectives. So first, to elucidate perceptions on the safety, risks, and therapeutic potential of psychedelic therapy, as well as merit for future research. The second is to assess for associations between attitudes towards PAP and demographics. The next one is to assess for associations between attitudes or opinions and knowledge. The next is to assess for differences in opinions between registered psychologists and students. And then lastly, to assess for associations between opinions and previous use of psychedelics. So note that any of the research objectives, questions, or hypotheses that I've listed that have to do with personal use of psychedelics are all tentative, because this question within my survey is optional and non-mandatory. So it's going to sort of depend on the kind of data that comes out of it. The research questions follow the research objectives. So what do Canadian psychologists and students think about psychedelics? What is the relationship between openness towards psychedelics and knowledge of them? What is the relationship between openness towards psychedelics and various demographic categories, whether it be age, gender, years of practice, student versus registered status? And then the last question is, again, tentative, but what is the relationship between openness towards psychedelics and previous psychedelic use? So taking into consideration my research objectives and questions, along with the brief literature review I've provided, here are my sort of hypotheses. First, I think that greater knowledge of psychedelics and psychedelic research will be associated with more favorable views towards psychedelics. This is sort of due to the findings from Barnett and colleagues and Hearn and colleagues. Second, I hypothesize that favorable views will be associated with younger age. This could be due to generational differences, with the potential for younger generations having less knowledge of the criminalizing and stigmatizing history of psychedelics, as well as just a greater interest in consuming literature on the media, especially, as we've seen psychedelics have gained a lot of traction within the media. And my third hypothesis is graduate students will hold more favorable views than registered psychologists. This one kind of goes hand in hand with the first two, as graduate students are likely in a younger age group than registered psychologists. Fourth, men will hold more favorable views towards psychedelics and PAP than women. This is again kind of due to the findings from Barnett and Hearn and colleagues. And then lastly, tentative again, but individuals who have used psychedelic drugs will hold more favorable views towards them. So on to my method. For my participants, as I've kind of mentioned, the target populations are registered psychologists. This includes provisionally registered psychologists, as well as students enrolled in a psychology graduate program in Canada. I chose these two groups because psychologists are likely to be the health professionals administering adjunctive psychotherapy, and psychology graduate students are the future generation of psychologists. So their perceptions will also likely have implications for the accessibility and use of this treatment option. Also, due to the extensive education and registration requirements to become a registered psychologist, I wanted to include that graduate student sample, so that I can get that younger demographic, which might have otherwise been missing from data if I only selected registered psychologists. And so inclusion criteria requires participants be 18, meet the sample criteria I'm looking for, be residing in Canada, and be able to speak, read, and write in English. So this research uses a 43-item survey, which I have made by adapting Davis and colleagues and Barnett and colleagues surveys on psychologists and psychiatrists' perceptions. I've obtained written consent from both authors to use and modify the surveys. And I'll go into greater detail into what my survey assesses on the next slide. And so in terms of procedure, the survey is online on Qualtrics. And upon giving informed consent, participants will be able to complete it online, should take 10 to 20 minutes. And then at the end of the survey, participants will be debriefed and have the opportunity to provide final consent. So the demographic variables I'm looking at include things like age, province, gender identity, religious affiliation, current training level, whether they're registered, and then the university that they attend, if applicable. I've also included some knowledge questions. So these are questions that have to do with psychedelics generally, as well as some of the recent findings that have been coming out and recent research that's been coming out with psychedelics and with PAP. So these have been modified from Barnett's survey, as their survey was geared towards psychiatrists, and I'm looking at psychologists. So my questions have removed sort of the medical focus, and they're also more geared towards participants in Canada, as Barnett and colleagues did theirs in the States. For opinions, these questions will include perceptions on promise, risk, recreational use, concerns regarding psychedelic therapy and its legalization, what their learning interests are, and what sort of knowledge sources they've used to inform themselves about psychedelic therapy. I've also included a few open-ended questions that ask sort of just general thoughts about clinical use, why or why not they believe psychedelics should be available for clinical use, and sort of any other thoughts that they want to share. And lastly, I've also included Davis and colleagues' modified version of the acceptability of PAT based on the treatment acceptability rating form. So this addition to the survey further assesses opinions by asking, for example, subjective ratings of understanding of psychedelic therapy and the acceptability of an openness to psychedelic therapy. Here are my proposed analyses, which of course are tentative, kind of depending on what data set I'm working with. So I'm anticipating I will calculate summary descriptive statistics for each item, do some correlational analyses to look for sort of those degrees of association between the various groups. For between group comparisons, I'll be looking at differences of opinion between the two samples of psychologists and students relative to age and psychedelic knowledge. Within group comparisons, we'll assess for associations between the variables of demographics, opinions, and psychedelic knowledge within groups. And then just lastly, any qualitative data will be assessed for themes and coded as categorical to sort of assess for frequency of those themes. There are a number of ethical considerations for this line of research. So first and foremost, informed consent is a major ethical consideration for any line of research, but especially for psychedelics, given the rich history of psychedelic research, as well as asking individuals and professionals to comment on a topic that's still considered to be taboo by some people. So the survey starts off with a consent form that overviews informed consent topics. Also, all information will be kept strictly confidential and anonymous. This is emphasized especially due to the legal, or rather illegal, status of psychedelics and the associated stigma, as this may lead some participants to experience some discomfort in answering questions about them or being given the opportunity to report favorable views about them. As well, a breach in confidentiality has the potential to impact the reputation of registered psychologists, as psychedelics are still mostly illegal and stigmatized. So that is a very important ethical consideration. And then just lastly, within my debriefing form at the end of my survey, I've provided resources and support for participants in the event that they experience discomfort. For implications, there are several to be noted. First, it's of course important to assess opinions regarding PAP as PAP gains more and more traction and more accessibility within Canada. It's important to see sort of what those perceptions are, where the barriers are, and where the opportunities are. This research may also address gaps within psychology education. So due to the limited knowledge of psychedelics held by some psychologists, which has been noted in some of the literature, and then the impact that this may have on perceptions, it's important to assess these variables within my survey to inform whether education programs should seek to include the topic of psychedelics. So within my survey, I intend to assess learning interests by asking some questions about it. So this research has the potential to be relevant to education programs. This research also has the potential to inform policy and practice, as psychologists will have the opportunity to share general thoughts about psychedelics, why they do or don't believe they should be available, and anything else that they want to share. So this information could be relevant to policymakers. And lastly, this research may shed some additional light on stigma and misconceptions about psychedelic therapy, and sort of how these misconceptions could be impacting stigma, as these two concepts have been shown to impact mental health professionals' endorsements and implementation of this treatment, and just future implementation in a broader context. So here are some references. Thank you so much for your time and for your attention. Thanks again to MAPS for inviting me. And here I've just provided a QR code for my survey. I can also share the link in the chat for anyone that's interested in checking it out or sharing. So I'll leave this slide up for a couple of moments, and then I think we're on to our Q&A section.
Yeah, thank you so much, Victoria. That was an excellent presentation, and I'm really excited to see where the research goes and what you find.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, if you would like to send that link in the chat as well, that's great. You just sent it. So we got one question in the chat from Jeff. And he asks if you have any ideas about why men might tend to hold more favorable views towards psychedelics and psychedelic-assisted psychotherapy than women.
That's a great question. It's difficult to say because I haven't read much into sort of the background of gender differences within perceptions towards certain therapies. So I'm not entirely sure why that might be. But I'll have to mull that over. That was a very good question. Caught me off guard for sure.
Yeah, it's interesting for sure. And I mean, like, I guess the prediction is mostly just from what you've found in the literature before, but not necessarily any specific basis. But yeah, I mean, my sort of like thinking is it could just have to do with how who the spokespeople are on psychedelics, and like sort of how they're perceived in popular culture is the voices are like could be very male dominated.
Yeah, I'd be curious to see sort of what the rates are of use of psychedelics between the two genders. I imagine it would be higher for men if they are expressing more openness towards psychedelics as well.
Yeah, perhaps a greater inclination towards risk-taking behavior, Jeff says. And yeah, that could be influencing psychedelic use as well as what people think. So that's a good point.
Yeah, great question, Jeff.
Yeah, you definitely touched on this a little bit, but my personal question was just about how you feel this research might help with advancing the field of psychedelics, like what you feel would be the most important aspect of putting out this survey and getting the results.
Difficult to say which is most important, but I think that because it's gaining so much traction and because we're seeing more and more doors open for the potential to use psychedelics and to use PAP through the special access program, through all these clinical trials that are popping up, it's really important to assess these perceptions to see sort of what the rate of acceptance would be, or even just to see where those barriers lie. Because psychologists would likely be the ones administering this therapy, the ones informing clients about this therapy. So I imagine that would have a huge impact, even if a client was aware of the potential for psychedelics or PAP rather, and they presented that to a psychologist. The way that psychologist responds is going to have a huge impact on whether that client ends up using that type of therapy, and what sort of information that they gain from that. So just the overall use and integration of this therapy within society is largely dependent on legality for sure and policies, but as well as the accessibility that's mitigated by psychologists.
Yeah, absolutely. And it seems like it also just goes back to like education and how it might be perceived in people's training.
Yeah, that was the next thing I was going to say. I didn't get much training on this aside from little snippets within an undergraduate personality psych course, which I don't think anyone else that I've spoken to has had that experience. And so I think that it's still met with a lot of stigma and just misconceived notions. And as we've seen in the previous literature, knowledge of psychedelics is, of course, going to impact those perceptions. So I'm wondering if we have an ethical duty to at least mention something about psychedelics within education programs, if it's going to pop up.
Yeah, and things will definitely change as the legal landscape evolves. Yeah.
Yeah. Who knows what's to come, but good to be prepared.
Yeah, does anyone else have questions? Feel free also to unmute, turn on your video, ask those questions. That's a great question, actually. Satya, I'm not quite sure how to pronounce your name, but they're asking, if there were not limits, what is your dream vision of where you are and what you would like to do in 5 to 10 years?
Where do you see yourself in 5 years? That's a good question as well. I have been considering that a lot lately, especially as I'm wrapping up my master's degree. I'm hopefully wrapping up my thesis next semester. So that is an important consideration for me, especially right now. I think in 5 to 10 years, I would like to see myself continuing research within this field. I think specifically having to do with psychedelics and psychedelic therapy and LGBTQ community. I think that there's a rich history between those two concepts, or rather the population and the concept of PAP. And so I would be interested in doing some research specific to that. Also, that population often gets overlooked in a lot of research. So I would like to look into that in some capacity, and hopefully also be doing something on the clinical front. I know that there's a lot of programs now that provide training for administering psychedelic assisted therapy and being in those sessions. So I would love to be on the front lines of that. I think that's kind of like, those are probably my 2 dream goals as of right now.
Yeah, that's awesome. And yeah, I guess if there are no other questions, I maybe had like a small one, is if you could better illustrate sort of how those elements of the survey would look like in terms of measuring attitudes. Like, what's an example question that you would be asking someone to assess how they perceive psychedelics?
Like within my survey, you mean?
Yeah.
Yeah, if you're curious, you can also feel free to check out my survey online. Keeping in mind, of course, inclusion criteria, but well, there are 2 ways that I assess sort of attitudes towards psychedelics. The first is just general questions where it's on a Likert scale. So from strongly disagree to strongly agree, whether it be psychedelics, I believe psychedelics have merit for further research, or I think that psychedelics could be useful in clinical settings for treating mental disorders, as well as that acceptability of PAT form that has been revised that is also included. So that kind of just looks at overall acceptance of PAP within clinical use. And then also just the open-ended questions that are in there tap directly into that and provide the opportunity for participants to share whatever opinion is most pertinent to them regarding psychedelics and psychedelic therapy.
Yeah, so it seems like a decently comprehensive way of looking at things. Another question about, has there been any discussion of use of psychedelics in organizations or communities? Which I guess it pertains to the part of your survey about psychedelic use.
Has there been any discussion of use of psychedelics in organizations and communities?
Yeah, that was the question.
Well, yes, I believe that through the special access program in Canada, certain providers can provide, or I guess, yeah, help navigate that program with clients. And I believe you apply, and if they determine that there is a need that has not been met by various other treatment methods, because psychedelic therapy is most likely not going to be your first line of defense, mostly likely going to require that you've tried some other treatment modalities. If there's a demonstrated need, and if there is no availability of the drug that you're looking for. So if there's literature to show that a certain psychedelic is helpful for the certain presenting problem that that client has, they can apply through the special access program. And then I also know there are clinical trials that provide the opportunity for participants to use psychedelics or to experience psychedelic assisted therapy. Then I think there's also some gray areas of some private practices that are kind of dabbling with the idea of integration therapy, so not necessarily helping clients access the psychedelics, but they'll support clients in integrating that knowledge and even preparing, because ultimately we can't really stop people from doing what they're going to do, but we can help them in doing it in a safe manner and sort of integrating that new knowledge.
And I think that would be all for questions, Victoria. So I'm just going to finish off and I will talk about our next session. So our next session is going to be in a month. It's instead of our usual Thursdays, it's going to be on a Tuesday. Manesh Gurn is going to be doing a presentation on psychedelic brain imaging. So he's just finished his PhD, starting his postdoc now. Is a very it's like a sort of like pioneering researcher in the field of psychedelic brain imaging, is working with Robin Carhart-Harris in his lab nowadays. So I'm very excited to have him present for the next session. We're going to be giving further announcements later on about who will be presenting in the new year. But in the meantime, we are still looking for presenters to line up our schedule for the winter and the spring. So please do email us if you have any specific suggestions for people that you'd like to see, or if you're someone who has some experience in the psychedelic research field and has research that they would like to present. My email is researchroom@mapscanada.org, and so you can reach me through there, and I will be able to provide any additional information. So I would love to thank everyone for coming, and thank you, Victoria, again for presenting. So our website is here, as well as our mailing list. I will be emailing out these slides in the next couple days, including a recording of last month's presentation, so Rotem's presentation on microdosing, as well as Victoria's presentation from today. And here is a link again to so we also have a link if you would like to consider donating to MAPS Canada to help us run these sessions, as well as other educational and research initiatives. And thank you guys so much for coming tonight.